At my wedding dinner, my sister smashed a glass and screamed, "This should have been my celebration." Then knocked over the gift table. My mom rushed to her side. "She's just overwhelmed." They left without a word. That night, I revoked my co-signer status on her lease and made an important decision. At 8 a.m., she was at my door, begging me to reconsider. The wine glass exploded against the restaurant floor at exactly 9:47 p.m. on what should have been the most peaceful night of my life. I know the exact time because I was checking my watch, calculating how much longer we'd need to stay before politely excusing ourselves from our own wedding celebration. It was supposed to be simple, a quiet dinner with family after our city hall ceremony earlier that day. No tuxedos, no elaborate ceremony, no grand speeches. Just a few signatures, some good food, and the people closest to us acknowledging the moment. That's all we wanted. A little calm, a little wine, a few familiar faces to mark the beginning of our marriage. But my sister Jessica had other plans. Her jealousy had always been the background hum of family gatherings, like a leaky faucet you learn to tune out until the ceiling finally caves in. But that night, in front of everyone who mattered to us, it erupted with a force that left glass shards scattered across the floor and years of family dynamics lying in ruins beside them. You could see the storm building from the moment she walked into the restaurant. She didn't hug anyone. She gave my new wife a quick, brittle smile that never reached her eyes and sat down without a word. The rest of the table didn't seem to notice, or maybe they were just used to Jessica's moods by now. I was, unfortunately. But this felt different. She wasn't just sulking in her usual passive-aggressive way. She was watching, waiting, coiled like a spring under too much pressure. Every compliment we received seemed to physically pain her. Every toast made her jaw clench tighter. When my uncle handed us an envelope with a card inside, she rolled her eyes so dramatically I was surprised they didn't pop out of her head. When my wife's younger sister shyly presented us with a handmade photo album she'd been working on for weeks, Jessica actually smirked and looked away like the gesture was somehow offensive. The bitterness was so obvious it started poisoning the entire atmosphere. I caught my mom glancing at Jessica nervously throughout dinner, but true to form, she said nothing. In our family, we'd always been trained to pretend Jessica's behavior was just something we had to weather, like a chronic illness that flares up unpredictably. The breaking point came right after dessert. We'd just been handed champagne flutes for what we thought would be a simple, heartfelt toast. My dad cleared his throat and began to stand, glass raised, when Jessica's chair screeched back against the hardwood floor. For one naive second, I actually thought she might be joining the toast. Maybe she'd found it in herself to be happy for us, or at least fake it convincingly enough to get through the evening. But then she spoke. This should have been my celebration. Not shouting, but loud enough that every conversation in the restaurant stopped. Loud enough that the couple at the table behind us turned to stare. Loud enough to ensure that every person in our party was now focused entirely on her. Which was, of course, exactly what she wanted. "This should have been my wedding dinner," she continued, her voice rising with each word. "This should have been my moment." And then, with the theatrical flourish that only Jessica could manage, she raised her wine glass, still full to the brim with the expensive Pinot Noir my dad had ordered, and smashed it onto the floor. The sound was sharp and final, like something essential breaking beyond repair. But she wasn't finished. In the stunned silence that followed, she stormed over to our modest gift table, mostly cards from family members, plus one carefully wrapped box for my wife's coworker, and shoved the entire thing over with both hands. Cards scattered across the floor. The wrapped box split open, revealing a delicate set of wine glasses that were now as shattered as Jessica's composure. My cousin's wife let out a small, shocked gasp. No one else moved. My wife sat completely still beside me, her hands steady on the table, her face carefully neutral in that way she'd perfected after years of dealing with my family's dysfunction. My dad stared down at his hands like he could disappear into them. And my mom, predictably, inevitably, rushed to Jessica's side like she was the one who'd just been attacked. "She's just overwhelmed," Mom said to the room, her voice high and desperate, like we were all supposed to nod sagely and forgive this complete meltdown. Like destroying someone else's wedding celebration was just a minor emotional hiccup that could be smoothed over with the right excuse. Nobody said anything. The restaurant had gone quiet, other diners craning their necks to watch our family implode in real time. I stood up. My wife stood with me. And without a word to anyone, we walked out. We didn't say goodbye. Didn't cause a bigger scene than Jessica had already created. We just left, stepping carefully around the broken glass and scattered cards, leaving behind the wreckage of what should have been a beautiful evening. I heard my mom calling after us, but I didn't stop. I wasn't going to stand there and let her rewrite the narrative like she always did, turning Jessica's selfishness into something we should understand and accommodate. I was done pretending Jessica was just sensitive or going through a hard time. She'd had every advantage in life and still somehow managed to convince everyone she was perpetually the victim. Back at home, we sat on our couch in silence. I didn't know what to say. How do you apologize for your sister destroying your wedding celebration? How do you explain away that kind of toxicity? My wife didn't push me to talk. After a few minutes, she finally broke the silence. I know this is hard, but this is her problem, not yours. You've been keeping her afloat for too long. And she was right. The rent payments I'd been covering. The grocery money when her monthly allowance ran out. The $12,000 I'd already set aside for her fall semester tuition. The countless random emergencies that always somehow required my immediate financial intervention. I was Jessica's backup plan for every bad decision she made, and everyone else in the family was perfectly content to let that arrangement continue indefinitely. That night, I opened my laptop. First, I revoked my co-signer status on Jessica's lease through the building's emergency portal. Then I canceled the tuition payment I'd scheduled for the following month. It wasn't impulsive. It was overdue by about 5 years. At 8 a.m. sharp, I woke to aggressive banging on our front door. I already knew who it was before I looked through the peephole. Jessica stood on our doorstep, still in pajamas, her hair a tangled mess, clutching her phone like a weapon. "You can't do this," she said the moment I opened the door. "I'm not joking, Nick. You can't." But I already had, and I wasn't going back. She wouldn't move from the doorway, blocking our entrance like a human barricade. I told her calmly that she could come inside to talk, but only if she could keep her voice down. That lasted about 30 seconds. The moment she stepped inside, she exploded. I was ruining her life, she screamed. I was being cruel and heartless. I had no right to pull my support without warning. As if her performance the night before hadn't been a flashing neon sign that something fundamental had to change. My wife stood in the hallway, listening quietly but saying nothing unless directly addressed. Jessica didn't like having an audience for her tantrum, especially one who refused to be drawn into the drama. She whirled on my wife, pointing an accusatory finger. "This is your fault. He never used to be like this. Never used to turn his back on family." I almost laughed at that part. She seemed to have conveniently forgotten every semester I'd helped pay for, every rent payment I'd covered, every time I'd bailed her out when she'd blown through her allowance on designer shoes or expensive dinners. That was me being family. And every time she'd talked down to me, rolled her eyes at my career choices, or made snide comments about how lucky I was to have everything handed to me, that was her version of family, too. "I had plans," Jessica said, her voice cracking with self-righteous indignation. "You knew that." I reminded her, as calmly as I could manage, that her so-called plans were exactly why she wasn't married yet. That maybe if she hadn't driven away her last boyfriend with constant demands, luxury vacations she couldn't afford, designer furniture for an apartment I was paying for, a brand new car that left him drowning in debt, she wouldn't be standing in my living room at 8 a.m. begging me to fund her life. That's when she turned her full fury on my wife. "I bet this was your idea, wasn't it? You've been poisoning him against me." My wife didn't take the bait. She simply said, "You're not a child anymore, Jessica. You can figure this out." And that was Jessica's final straw. She launched into a full-blown tantrum, screaming that we were heartless, that we'd regret destroying the family, that blood was supposed to mean something. She knocked over a chair on her way to the door and slammed it so hard behind her that a framed photo fell off our wall. We stood in the sudden silence, just the two of us and the sound of our own breathing. 10 minutes later, my mom called. "Just give her a little time," she pleaded. "She's stressed about school, about money. You know how she gets." I told her I wasn't going to change my mind. That I wasn't angry, just finished. And that I wasn't interested in hearing another elaborate explanation for Jessica's behavior. An hour after that, both my parents showed up at our door unannounced. They arranged themselves on our couch like they were staging an intervention, my dad looking uncomfortable but determined, my mom's eyes red from crying. Dad did most of the talking, which was unusual. He admitted they were exhausted too. That they'd been quietly covering some of Jessica's expenses without telling me. That they didn't want to keep enabling her, but they also didn't want to watch her fall apart completely. She's not as strong as you, Mom said, like that explained everything. You've always been the stable one. I asked them if they'd ever considered that maybe Jessica wasn't strong precisely because she'd never been required to be. That maybe constantly rescuing her from the consequences of her own choices wasn't actually helping anyone. It wasn't an angry conversation, just a long, exhausting one. They left without any real resolution, just the heavy sense that something in our family dynamic had shifted, possibly permanently. The rest of that day, I didn't do much of anything. My wife made coffee. We sat on our porch in comfortable silence. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was responsible for managing everyone else's emotions and emergencies. But Jessica wasn't finished with me yet. That evening, I got a text from Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, the same one she'd dumped months earlier when he couldn't keep up with her increasingly expensive lifestyle. He wanted to meet in person. Said he had something important to ask me. I didn't respond immediately. By the next morning, Jessica had sent 6 texts, starting with desperate pleading and escalating to guilt trips and finally a bizarre voice memo where she cried for a full minute without actually saying anything coherent. No apology. No acknowledgement of what she'd done at the restaurant. Just panic about rent and tuition and how I was ruining everything by refusing to continue bankrolling her choices. There were also 3 missed calls from Marcus. I hadn't spoken to him since the breakup. He used to be around constantly when he and Jessica were trying to play house in that overpriced apartment I'd co-signed for. He was a quiet guy who always seemed to be in a perpetual state of compromise, like he was constantly calculating the cost of keeping Jessica happy. You could read it all over his face. This wasn't what he'd thought he was signing up for. Out of curiosity, and maybe because I felt like I owed him more consideration than I owed Jessica at this point, I agreed to meet him. We met at a coffee shop near my office. He was already there when I arrived, hands wrapped around a black coffee, looking like he hadn't slept in days. She told me you pulled everything, he said without preamble. The lease, the tuition, all the support. I nodded. I wasn't in the mood to re-explain the obvious. He looked around the coffee shop like he was worried someone might be listening, then said something that caught me completely off guard. I tried, you know. I really did. But it was like nothing was ever enough for her. She didn't want a relationship, she wanted a sponsor. He said it without anger, just with a bone-deep exhaustion I recognized. He admitted they'd kept talking even after the breakup. That she'd told him she was planning to go back to school, that she'd convinced him I was still covering all her major expenses and all he'd need to do was help with groceries and gas money. Then he dropped the real bombshell. She told me you only changed because of your wife. That she pushed you to cut Jessica off. I looked him straight in the eye and told him the truth. No one pushed me. I just got tired. He didn't argue, just nodded like he'd already suspected as much. Then came the real reason for our meeting. He was hoping I'd reconsider covering the rent, just that one expense. She didn't have anywhere else to go, he explained, and he couldn't afford the place alone if she moved back in with him. I told him no. Not rudely, not angrily, just firmly. Like someone who'd finally learned what a boundary felt like. He thanked me anyway and said he'd figured that would be my answer. That was the last I heard from Marcus. When I got home, Jessica had already changed tactics. The morning's panic had transformed into calculated emotional manipulation. Messages like, I hope you're proud of making me feel worthless, and you chose a stranger over your own sister, and you'll regret this when I disappear from your life forever. Classic guilt tactics that I'd fallen for too many times to count. I muted her number. That same day, my mom called for the 3rd time since the restaurant incident. She didn't sound angry anymore, just defeated. She's been crying all day, Mom said. She's scared. Just help her get through this semester. That's all I'm asking. I told her, clearly and without room for negotiation. No. Then she asked if maybe my wife could talk to Jessica. Woman to woman, she said hopefully. I actually laughed out loud. For the first time in this entire mess, my wife laughed too. That night, Jessica posted something on Instagram, a blurry selfie of herself crying with the caption, betrayed by the people I thought loved me. She didn't mention names, but within hours I got 3 different texts from extended family asking what was going on. I didn't reply to any of them. The days that followed were quiet in a different way. The family group chat went silent. I stopped getting the usual check-in calls from relatives. Nobody outright blamed me, but nobody was defending my decision either. I was quietly becoming the family villain, the one who'd finally stopped enabling Jessica's behavior. But at home, things were better than they'd been in years. My wife and I were laughing more, sleeping better, making weekend plans that didn't involve emergency financial rescues or dramatic phone calls. For the first time in forever, I didn't feel like I was carrying someone else's responsibilities on my shoulders. We talked about skipping a big wedding celebration entirely. Maybe just a weekend getaway somewhere quiet. Something small and peaceful, with no opportunities for anyone to create drama. But deep down, I knew Jessica wasn't finished with us. People like her never end things with quiet acceptance. They always have one more card to play. For several weeks, everything remained eerily calm. Jessica had vanished from social media, from family group chats, from every corner of our extended family's ongoing drama. It was the longest stretch of peace I'd experienced in years. My wife and I finally felt like we could breathe. We started making actual plans for our future instead of just reacting to Jessica's latest crisis. For a brief, naive moment, I thought maybe she'd finally gotten the message. Then I got an email at work. Not a text or a call, but a formal email sent to my professional address from the financial aid office at Jessica's college. They were reaching out to confirm whether I'd modified my financial responsibility agreement for her fall semester, since she'd informed them that I was still covering her tuition and had submitted a signed authorization form on my behalf. At first, I thought there had been some administrative mix-up. But attached to the email was a PDF of the form in question. My signature was clearly visible at the bottom. Except it wasn't my signature. She'd forged it. It took me about 5 minutes to call the financial aid office and explain that no, I hadn't signed anything, and yes, I'd be happy to submit a formal fraud report. The administrator I spoke with was surprisingly calm about the situation. Apparently, this kind of thing wasn't uncommon. They immediately flagged Jessica's account and said she'd be contacted within 24 hours about the discrepancy. I sat at my desk afterward, staring at my computer screen in disbelief. It was one thing for Jessica to throw public tantrums or guilt-trip family members. But this was actual fraud. This was a crime. I didn't tell my wife about it immediately. I just forwarded the email to my personal account and closed my laptop, trying to process what Jessica had been willing to do to keep me financially trapped. A few hours later, she texted, "You're really going to leave me with nothing? After everything?" I didn't respond. An hour after that, there was a knock on our door. Not Jessica this time, my dad, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. "She didn't tell us what happened," he said. "Just that things got worse. We want to talk." My mom was waiting in the car, probably too embarrassed to face us directly. We sat on our front porch, and Dad asked if I could please reconsider, just for the sake of family peace. He said he understood my frustration, but the whole family was walking on eggshells and everyone was miserable. Then he paused and added something I hadn't expected. "She tried to take money from your mother's account. Said it was an accident, that she thought it was connected to hers. But we're starting to see things more clearly now." That stopped me cold. They weren't just asking me to help Jessica anymore. They were starting to realize what I'd been dealing with for years. I told him about the forged college form. He didn't say a word, just nodded slowly like another piece of a puzzle had fallen into place. Then he stood up, thanked me for being honest with him, and left without trying to change my mind. For the first time in memory, they weren't defending her behavior. Not even a little bit. But Jessica still wasn't done with us. The following week, she escalated in a way I never saw coming. Instead of showing up at our house, she went to my wife's office. She walked into the building like she had every right to be there, went straight to the reception desk, and asked to speak with my wife. Said it was urgent family business that couldn't wait. She never made it past the lobby. My wife got a heads-up call from the front desk and stayed in her office while building security escorted Jessica out. Jessica texted me afterward, "You've turned her into a monster." Neither of us responded. That night, we made a quiet decision. We canceled any remaining plans for a wedding celebration. No ceremony, no invitations, no reception. We'd officially registered our marriage and would book a simple weekend away. Just the two of us. My wife asked if I was okay with potentially being the family black sheep for a while. I already was, I told her. I was just too busy paying for everything to notice. The silence from the rest of my family continued. No invites to gatherings, no casual check-in calls, just thick, suffocating tension whenever we crossed paths at unavoidable family events. But for the first time in my adult life, my time and money were actually my own. Jessica was still out there somewhere, probably planning her next move. But the spell was broken. I wasn't going to keep picking up the pieces of her self-created disasters. By fall, it became clear that no one else had stepped in to replace me as Jessica's financial safety net. She wasn't enrolled in school. The apartment management had processed my lease removal, and according to my dad, she'd been served with a 30-day eviction notice. Marcus had apparently decided he wasn't going to be her backup plan either. Whatever connection they'd maintained after their breakup was permanently severed. For a while, Jessica tried to maintain appearances on social media. She posted throwback photos, shared vague inspirational quotes about independence, tagged herself at trendy cafes with captions about working hard on my goals. But behind the curated facade, she was scrambling. Mom let it slip during one of her increasingly rare phone calls that Jessica had moved back in with them, temporarily, while she figured things out. I stayed quiet about all of it. My wife and I focused on our own life, finally free from the constant drain of Jessica's manufactured crises. We took that weekend trip we'd planned, no interruptions, no emergency phone calls, no checking emails during dinner. We came back feeling like we were genuinely starting something new together. Then, one morning several months later, my mom called again. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. She sounded exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. "We're going to help pay for Jessica's final semester," she said without preamble. "Just this last one. After that, we're done. We're draining our savings account, but we can't do any more after this." She wasn't asking for my help or my opinion. She was just unloading the information like she needed someone else to know how much it was costing them. "And she got a job," Mom added. "Part-time, downtown. She's trying." I didn't say anything, just listened. Jessica never contacted me directly about any of this. No texts, no calls, just continued silence. It was the longest we'd gone without speaking since we were children. But that silence didn't mean I was forgiven. For the next several weeks, I got the cold shoulder from most of our extended family. Invitations dried up. Cousins stopped responding to texts. Someone even unfollowed me on social media. My wife noticed and laughed. "You're officially the black sheep now." I shrugged. Feels better than being the ATM. Then, out of nowhere, I received an invitation to a family dinner. Nothing elaborate, just parents, a couple of aunts and uncles, a few cousins. Hosted at my parents' house. My wife raised an eyebrow when I showed her the message. "Think they're setting you up for something?" I did. But we went anyway. The moment we walked in, I knew I'd been right to be suspicious. Everyone was already seated, and Jessica was there, hair done, wearing nice clothes, positioned between my mom and one of our uncles like nothing had ever happened. The silence when we entered was the kind where everyone's working too hard to pretend things aren't weird. We sat down. Mom served dinner. Dad poured wine. Small talk floated around the table like everyone was trying desperately to act normal. Halfway through the meal, Jessica turned toward me and said, not loudly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I just want to say I'm sorry." Forks stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even my wife tilted her head slightly in surprise. Jessica kept her eyes on her plate. "I shouldn't have ruined your dinner. Or done the other things." That was it. No mention of the forged documents. No acknowledgement of showing up at my wife's workplace. Just a flat, vague apology that sounded like it had been rehearsed. I looked at her, then at my parents. Mom gave me this hopeful little smile, like she wanted me to pat Jessica on the head and declare everything forgiven. I didn't do that. But I did nod and say, "Thanks. I appreciate you saying that." Nobody breathed for a second. Then someone asked about the potato salad, and conversation awkwardly resumed. The rest of the evening was determinately uneventful. Everyone said goodbye like we were all fine, like the family had been successfully patched back together. But I noticed something interesting. Jessica never once asked about our marriage. Never said congratulations. Never mentioned the courthouse ceremony or our weekend trip. Probably because she'd already had her own quiet courthouse wedding 2 weeks earlier. No ceremony, No social media posts, no family celebration. We only found out because Mom mentioned it accidentally in passing. I let it go. Not because I'd forgiven Jessica, but because I didn't need her validation anymore. She'd finally gotten what she wanted, a marriage, a degree, a part-time job, and a room back in our parents' house. And I'd gotten what I wanted too, freedom. 6 weeks after that awkward dinner where Jessica delivered her half-hearted apology, Dad called to invite us to Mom's birthday celebration. Just family, he said. Nothing big. Jessica would be there with her new husband. We went. It was held at a quiet restaurant, and Jessica and her husband were already seated when we arrived. She gave us a polite nod. That was the extent of our interaction. Dinner was civil in that carefully rehearsed way that feels hollow. Everyone talked about safe topics, work, recipes, weather, anything but the months of drama that had nearly torn our family apart. Then my aunt raised her glass toward the end of the evening. Let's just be grateful we're all here tonight, after everything. It's good to see everyone come together again. A few people nodded and murmured agreement. Jessica's husband added, "It's nice when families know how to forgive." That was their version of closure, a public performance of reconciliation with no real substance behind it. No mention of what Jessica had done, what she'd tried to get away with, or who had paid the price for her behavior. I didn't correct anyone. I just smiled, said I was glad things were better, and kept my mouth shut. We left early. On the drive home, my wife asked if the evening had given me any sense of closure. I told her the truth. I don't feel anything, because that's how it ends in families like mine. Not with real apologies or honest conversations, just silence and smiles and pretending nothing ever happened. I paused, watching the city lights blur past our car window. And I can live with that, as long as they don't expect me to forget. Because I haven't forgotten. The shattered wine glass, the overturned gift table, the forged documents, the attempts to manipulate and guilt trip us back into the old dynamic where I existed primarily to solve Jessica's problems. I remember all of it. But now those memories feel like artifacts from someone else's life, someone who hadn't yet learned the difference between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. Jessica got her fairy tale ending, even if it required burning down half the family in the process. And I got something better, a life where my worth isn't measured by my willingness to subsidize other people's poor choices.